Yes, good morning, everyone. Am I audible? Can you see the screen, all of you? Yeah? Okay, fine. So before starting with the discussion of this year's economic survey, let us have a brief discussion about what exactly the economic survey is and how this year's economic survey is different from the previous year's economic survey and how we would approach the economic survey. So let's have a brief discussion about these aspects. So if you look at the economic survey, it is basically a document which is prepared by the chief economic advisor, which works under the Ministry of Finance. Usually, we used to have two volumes of economic surveys, volume 1 and volume 2. As far as the volume 1 of the economic survey is concerned, the volume 1 of the economic survey basically discusses the most pressing challenges and problems before the Indian economy, and accordingly, it gives its own suggestions. Like last year, am I audible? Yes? Okay, some of you are, in case if you're not been able to hear me, please check the audio system at your end. Okay. So like I was saying, usually we used to have two volumes of economic survey, volume 1 and volume 2. Volume 1 used to discuss the most pressing challenges before the Indian economy. Like last year, we had some interesting chapters as to whether India should focus on increasing its GDP size or should it focus on reducing the income inequality. Similarly, we had a chapter related to sustainability of debt. So as you can see, as far as volume 1 of the economic survey is concerned, it is more important from the perspective of the mains examination. So one could have expected direct questions from the volume 1 of the economic survey in the mains examination. Apart from that, some aspects of the volume 1 you could have incorporated as a fodder points while writing an answer in the mains examination. As far as volume 2 of the economic survey is concerned, the volume 2 of the economic survey gives you a bird's eye view of the entire Indian economy. So it gives you details about various macroeconomic parameters of the economy, such as the GDP growth rate, the tax to GDP ratio, the current status of the external sector, the status of different sectors in the Indian economy, such as agriculture sector, industrial sector, and so on. So as far as the volume 2 of the economic survey is concerned, it was more important from the perspective of the prelims examination. So this was how economic survey used to be prepared before. But like I said, this time economic survey is different from the previous economic surveys. In what way? First and foremost, this year's economic survey has been prepared by the principal economic advisor, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. Why? This is so because the chief economic advisor, he completed his tenure somewhere in the month of October or November 2021, and immediately no one was appointed as the chief economic advisor. So since the office of the chief economic advisor was vacant, so in his place, this time the economic survey has been prepared by the principal economic advisor. But it is said that it's a one-off event. So from future, that is in future, the economic surveys will be prepared by the chief economic advisor only. Only this year, it has been prepared by the principal economic advisor. That's the first thing. Second thing here is, as I said, previously we used to have two volumes of economic surveys. But this time, we have only one volume of economic survey. The reason being, in the preface of the economic survey, Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal has clearly highlighted as to why the government has decided to come out with just one volume. The reason, when the economic survey was initially published way back in 1950s, we used to have only around 50 pages in the economic survey. And from 50 pages in the economic survey to start off with, last year's economic survey, including the statistical appendix, it was around 900 pages. So it is becoming very voluminous. It was becoming very bulky. So to reduce the size of the economic survey, we have decided to come up with just one volume of economic survey. I hope we are clear now. So as you can see, this time, last time when we had discussed economic survey, there are a lot of points to be discussed in detail because it was important even from the perspective of the mains examination as well. But this time, it is seen that the economic survey as such does not hold much relevance as far as the mains examination is concerned. It is more important from the perspective of the prelims examination. Apart from that, the economic survey as such, it has huge amount of data, huge amount of facts and figures. And please understand that not all of these aspects become important as far as your prelims examination is concerned. You have to be very selective when you read economic survey for the perspective of the prelims examination. And how are we going to approach this year's economic survey? See, the theme of this year's economic survey is the agile approach, that is art and science of policy making in India. So I will discuss later as to what is agile approach. And as far as our approach towards the economic survey is concerned, we will also adopt the agile approach to the economic survey. So whatever approach the government has followed with respect to the Indian economy, that is the agile approach, the same agile approach we will adopt as far as discussing Indian economy is concerned, right? So let's start our discussion with the economic survey. So there will be two classes as far as economic survey is concerned. Today is the first class, and next Sunday we'll be having the second class. In the first class, I shall be discussing the two most important chapters of the economic survey, chapter 1 and chapter 2. The remaining chapters I will be covering in the next part, that is the next weekend. Clear? So let's start off with the first chapter of the economic survey. The first chapter of the economic survey is state of economy. So this particular chapter basically starts off with discussing and analyzing as to what is the theme of this year's economic survey. After analyzing the theme of this year's economic survey, it gives us a bird's eye view of the entire Indian economy. So in a way, this particular chapter can be considered to be a summary of all other remaining 10 chapters. So as far as we are concerned, what we will do is we'll start off our analysis with respect to understanding and decoding the theme of this year's economic survey. So we will understand as to what is the agile approach, the Barbell strategy which the government has adopted to deal with the economic slowdown, various safety nets which the government has provided for the vulnerable sections, supply side measures. Now, all of these aspects, they can be used as a fodder points while writing an answer in the UPSC mains examination. As far as the remaining 3 topics are concerned, they become more important from the perspective of the prelims examination. So directly we can get questions with respect to these aspects, right? So let's start our discussion with decoding and understanding as to what is the theme of this year's economic survey. Let's start with that. Okay. If you see the theme of last year's economic survey, the theme of last year's economic survey was saving lives and livelihoods. And the theme of this year's economic survey is agile approach, art and science of policy making. Let's understand as to what exactly is this agile approach. See, last year's economic survey had clearly highlighted that the COVID-19 crisis, it is once in a century crisis. The COVID-19 crisis has clearly shown us as to how a healthcare crisis can well transform into a socio-economic crisis. This was what was highlighted in the last year's economic survey. As far as this year's economic survey is concerned, to a certain extent, this year's economic survey highlights that the COVID-19 crisis, in a way, can be considered as a kind of watershed movement in the world's economic history. Now, what do you mean by watershed movement? Watershed movement means the world which comes into being after that event will be completely different from the world which was in existence before that event. Examples? If you go back to the world's economic history, particularly events such as the Great Economic Depression of 1930s, the First World War, the Second World War, they were all considered to be a kind of watershed moments. For example, if you have read world history, you'll get to know that after the Second World War, there was complete transformation in the world's geopolitics, right? There was complete transformation in terms of world economy. That is why we call Second World War as a watershed moment. Similar to that, COVID-19 crisis is also considered as a watershed moment. The world that we will come into being after COVID, post-COVID world, which this world will be different from the pre-COVID world. So that's the first thing as far as the COVID is concerned. Second thing is COVID, in a way, it can also be considered as crisis of uncertainties. Because every time when the COVID affected us, there was uncertainties, there was huge amount of unpredictability. The future was constantly changing, it was constantly evolving. It was very difficult for us to predict the outcomes. And this was one of the biggest challenge before the policymakers, not just in India, but across the world as well. So constantly things were changing, things were uncertain. So how do you make policies when things in future look uncertain, when it is very difficult to predict the outcomes? How do you make policies? Just imagine if you were at a high profile position in the government and required to make policies, especially during the times of COVID. Imagine you are a secretary in the Department of Health. Imagine you are a chief economic advisor. Imagine, let's say you are a secretary in the Department of Economic Affairs. How would you make policies to deal with such uncertainties? So here, this year's economic survey has highlighted that to deal with such kind of uncertainties, the policymakers in India have adopted the Agile approach. So that is called as art and science of policy making. So let's first understand as to what kind of uncertainties did we come across during the COVID as well as aftermath of the COVID. So what kind of uncertainties are we looking at both during the times of COVID and post-COVID? So broadly, if you have to look at the uncertainties, the first uncertainties can be seen in terms of socio-economic uncertainties. For example, you must be knowing that in case of India, almost 90% of the workers are informal workers. And when lockdown was imposed, these informal workers, they had uncertainties with respect to their future jobs, future incomes. And because of such uncertainties, these urban migrants started migrating back to rural India. So why did this migration take place? It was purely on account of uncertainties about their future jobs, future incomes, future livelihoods. Similarly, when the lockdown was lifted, it was expected that the private sector will come in and start making investment into the economy. But this did not happen. Why? Because the private sector as such had uncertainties with respect to the profits which they are going to make. So they had uncertainties as to whether the profits which they were able to make before, will they be able to make the same profits or not? So that was the uncertainty of the private sector. We had uncertainties with respect to the GDP growth rate as well. The GDP growth rate from 4%, it dropped down to minus 7.2%. And we had uncertainties as to whether the GDP growth rate will rebound or not. So at each and every stage, we had uncertainties. And even now, are we done away with these uncertainties? Even now, we have uncertainties because we don't know whether the new variants of COVID will emerge or not. And even if they emerge, will they be severe? Will they be more virulent? We have no idea about the future, right? So this is the uncertainties. Apart from that, as I said, COVID as such can be considered to be a watershed moment because the post-COVID world, it is going to be different from the pre-COVID world. This is the expectation. This is what has been predicted. The question is, in what way the post-COVID world is going to be different from the pre-COVID world? Let's understand that. See here, if you see, first one, is with respect to global supply chains. Now, this is very important. Please focus here. In the pre-COVID era, there was rapid emergence of global supply chains. In the pre-COVID era, COVID as such has exposed the vulnerabilities as far as the global supply chains is concerned. And that is why it is expected that in the post-COVID world, probably countries will put less emphasis on the global supply chains, and in its place, there will be emergence of regional supply chains. Now, why this transformation is going to take place from the pre-COVID to post-COVID world? Let me explain this. Starting with the concept of the global value chains. Now, in case of global value chains, what happens is different countries across the globe, they contribute to the process of production of a particular commodity depending upon their area of expertise. For example, if this marker has to be manufactured, different countries would contribute to the process of production according to their area of expertise. Some of the best examples of the global value chains include the manufacturing of mobile phones, manufacturing of pharmaceutical drugs, the automobile sector, and so on. One of the most often quoted example of global value chain is with respect to the manufacturing of Apple iPhones. See, if you look at the basic design, the basic research and development of the iPhones, it takes place in countries such as USA. Countries such as Germany, Japan, etc., they provide for critical inputs for the manufacturing of the Apple iPhones. And the final assembly of Apple iPhone takes place in the countries where the labor cost is lower. Example being China. So can you see here, different countries are contributing to the process of production depending upon their area of expertise. So the pre-COVID world had seen the rapid growth of the global value chains. But then what happened? The COVID as such has exposed the vulnerabilities in the global value chains. How? Now, when COVID was rapidly spreading across the globe, different countries impose lockdowns at different points of time. I repeat, different countries impose lockdown at different points of time, which means that one particular country was unable to provide for a critical input for manufacturing a product. And if one country is not able to provide for a critical input, can I say the entire global supply chain gets disrupted? Example, China. China is considered to be the largest manufacturing hub. China is considered to be one of the largest exporter of goods. So when lockdown was imposed in China, ultimately the entire world economy suffered. Why? Because it's like most of the world economy is dependent on China to provide for certain critical goods, certain critical services. So if something happens in China, it is not just going to affect China, it is going to affect the entire world economy. So this was exposed on account of the COVID-19 pandemic. For example, if you look at China, China is considered to be one of the largest supplier of APIs, which stand for active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs. Now, APIs, that is active pharmaceutical ingredients, they are used as raw materials for manufacturing of pharmaceutical drugs. In fact, India also imports 65 to 70% of active pharmaceutical ingredients from China. So can I say, when lockdown was imposed in China, this in turn adversely affected the supply of pharmaceutical drugs throughout the world, right? Apart from that, you must be hearing stories about shortage of semiconductors now. Some of the countries which are considered to be largest suppliers of semiconductors include countries such as Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. Now, these countries are unable to ramp up the production of semiconductors. And these semiconductors, as such, they are used as raw materials in the automobile sector. So the global supply chain disruption in the semiconductors is in turn adversely affecting the growth of the automobile sector in India. So the countries have now realized that global value chains are very vulnerable If something happens in one country, it has a potential to affect all other countries. So now in future, post-COVID, in the post-COVID, we are going to see a emergence of regional supply chains. What is regional supply chain? In case of regional supply chains, countries whose interests are converging at international geopolitics, whose interests are same, these countries will come together and set up their own supply chains. Example being the Supply Chain Resilience Initiative. I hope you must have heard about this. Supply Chain Resilience Initiative is an initiative of countries such as Japan and India. Why are we doing it? We are doing it because we want to set up alternative supply chains which is independent of China, to reduce dependence on China. So it is being said that the post-COVID world will see a rapid emergence of regional supply chains. Countries whose interests are converging, they come together and they'll set up a regional supply chain. So that's the first thing which is going to happen in the post-COVID world. The second thing is, during the COVID, countries have realized that when it comes to certain critical goods, certain critical services, they would have to manufacture these critical goods and services on their own rather than being dependent upon the import from other countries. So slowly, the COVID has led to the emergence of economic nationalism. Countries have now realized that they have to ramp up the production of certain critical goods and services. Best example of such kind of economic nationalism can be seen in the concept of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Are you getting this point? What is Atmanirbhar Bharat? Be self-sufficient India. So here we are trying to ramp up the production. For example, as part of the self-sufficient India or Atmanirbhar Bharat, we are trying to increase the production of active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs. We are trying to increase the production of semiconductors within our own economy. So now the countries are focusing more upon economic nationalism rather than, free trade. So that's the second part. Third, countries have now realized that healthcare is something which cannot be neglected. So now countries are giving much more emphasis on ramping up their healthcare infrastructure. Nextly, if you see, the COVID-19 has led to growing inequalities, not just in India, but across the globe. So to address this growing inequalities, countries across the world are going to focus on providing the necessary safety net for the people who belong to the bottom strata of the society. Next, as far as technological advancements is concerned, see, even before COVID, technological advancement was taking place. But what COVID has done is it has further accelerated the adoption of technology. Technological adoption was taking place, but what COVID has done further accelerated the adoption of technology. Example being, COVID has led to the emergence of or rapid adoption of digital learning, online learning. It has led to the adoption of work from home. And it is being said that post-COVID, probably countries will start moving more towards Industrial Revolution 4.0 with a greater emphasis on the new age disruptive technologies such as Internet of Things, machine learning, robotics, big data, artificial intelligence, and so on. And last and most important is even the consumer behavior is also changing on account of COVID. Consumer behavior in terms of how we eat, how we shop, how we watch movies, and how we travel. So in each of these aspects, consumer behavior is changing. For example, earlier, people would prefer to go out and eat in hotels and restaurants. But now people would prefer ordering food from Swiggy or Zomato. Similarly, people earlier would prefer to go out and shop, but now people would prefer to order clothes online from, say, Flipkart or Amazon. So each and every aspect of our life is getting changed now. To what extent that will sustain, we don't know, but it is changing, right? So if you look at COVID, COVID has led to two things. One thing is it has thrown up a number of uncertainties, unpredictabilities before us. And second, the post-COVID world, it is expected to be different from the pre-COVID world. So how do we make policies under such circumstances? That is what this particular chapter discusses about. So here, if you see, this particular chapter says that during normal times, when everything is normal, when future is certain, when future is predictable, during such times, we will use waterfall approach. But when future is uncertain, when future is unable to be predicted, that time what is needed is the agile approach. If someone comes from the software industry, probably they will know about this agile approach and the waterfall approach. It is basically used in the software development as well as the project management. So what is this waterfall approach and agile approach? Now, before discussing this waterfall approach and agile approach purely from the perspective of economy, I will first discuss this concept of waterfall approach and agile approach from the perspective of your preparation for the examination. So I will explain agile approach and waterfall approach from a day-to-day life example. And based upon that understanding, I'll extend the same logic to the government's art and science of policy making, right? So let's first understand as to what is the waterfall approach of policy making. Let's understand that. To understand the waterfall approach to policy making, I would want you to go back to your school days. Remember, just think you are going to appear for class 6 or class 7 examination. Life used to be very, very easy then, right? Unlike the UPSC examination. So if you go back to school days, class 6 or class 7 examination, now can I say you had very limited sources to study? Apart from limited sources, you already had a kind of idea as to what kind of questions are going to appear in the examination. Sometimes if the teacher was very friendly, the teacher himself used to say that these are the important questions. And most often, these important questions used to appear in the examination. So when you used to prepare for the school examination, the sources from where you are required to study, that was certain. The kind of questions which are expected, that was also certain. There was less unpredictability when it comes to preparing for your school exams, right? So what you used to do for preparing the school exams? You know this, that the future is certain, future is predictable. You used to make a plan. Once you used to make a plan that you will study from so-and-so source, you will concentrate on so-and-so topics. So once you make a plan, you used to finally execute the plan and get very, very high marks. I'm pretty sure that most of you would have scored like 95%, 99% in your school examination by adopting this waterfall approach, right? Life was easy then. So what is waterfall approach? So in case of waterfall approach, what we do, we first understand the problem. Based upon the understanding the problem, we know as to what is going to happen in future. The future is certain, future is predictable. And then you make a plan and the plan is executed to meet the outcomes. So that is a kind of waterfall approach. Now just think and tell me, is it possible for you to adopt this waterfall approach when it comes to UPSC examination? In your school examination, the sources from where you have to study was limited. The kind of questions which are expected, you were certain about it. When it comes to UPSC examination, the sources are not certain. The kind of questions which are going to appear is not certain. So there is high level of unpredictability when it comes to the UPSC examination. So waterfall approach is something which could have been used for your school exams and not when you're preparing for the UPSC examination. So question is, how do you prepare for the UPSC examination, which is so uncertain, so unpredictable? How do you do it? Now let's say one fine day, one student decides, I'm going to take a plunge into civil service examination. I'm going to start studying for civil service examination. So what the student will do, initially he'll make a plan. He'll make a grand plan, a kind of master plan, that I'm going to study all of these subjects. I'm going to read all of these sources. This is a master plan that he makes. But then what happens is, after a certain duration of time, in his preparation time, he realizes, based upon the analysis of the previous year question papers, that not all the subjects are equally important. Some subjects are more important than others. For example, economy, polity, history, they are more important than others based upon the analysis of previous year question papers. So what does he do? he takes a feedback from where? From the previous year question papers. Based upon the analysis of the previous year question papers, he takes a feedback and then fine-tunes his preparation, fine-tunes his plan. So here, in case of UPSC examination, you have to continuously keep on updating your preparation plans in accordance with the changing pattern, evolving pattern of the examination. This is one thing. Similarly, let's say you attempt a mock test. After attempting a mock test, you sit down, analyze, and try to find out where you have committed mistakes, why you have committed mistakes, how those mistakes could have been avoided. Can I say once again, you're taking that as a feedback to your preparation plans? Once again, based upon your performance in the mock test, you are taking that as a feedback and once again fine-tuning your preparation. Suppose, say, if you're weak based upon, say, the mock test, you get to know that you're weak in certain part of economy. You take that as a feedback and focus more upon those aspects in which you feel you are weak. So every time your preparation plans is getting updated based upon the feedback thing. I hope you're getting this point. So waterfall approach is something which is, more apt when future is certain, future is predictable, something like your school examination. When future is uncertain, future is unpredictable, what is needed is agile approach. So in case of agile approach, what we do is we make small changes. We make small changes. After making small changes, we understand the impact of those changes. After understanding the impact of those changes, we take a feedback and once again reformulate the plans. So it's more like a circular approach to the policy making. So if you have to extend the same logic of waterfall approach and agile approach to the government's policy making, I hope all of you must have heard about formulation of 5-year plans in India, right? Earlier, the planning commission used to make 5-year plans. On what basis the 5-year plans were made? It was made on the basis of waterfall approach, right? Because the future was certain, future was predictable. Based upon that, we used to make a master plan for the next 5 years. Similarly, the urban development plans that we make, even that is based upon the waterfall approach. Not just that, the allocation that you make for MG Narega every year during normal times, even that is based upon the waterfall approach. Because during normal times, when everything is normal, the government can anticipate as to how many people are going to demand for work under MG Narega in the rural India. So based upon that anticipation, the government would allocate certain amount of money to MG Narega. So all of these can be considered as the waterfall approach. Now coming to the agile approach. Now in case of agile approach, say when things are uncertain, things are unpredictable. Now, can I say, with respect to this example, is it possible to allocate money just one time to MG Narega? Just one time allocation will it do? Probably not. Because, continuously people are coming from urban India to rural India and they're demanding for work. There is greater amount of rural distress. So what we do here under the agile approaches, initially we'll make some allocation for MG Narega. And then what we do is we track as to how many people are demanding for work under MG Narega. What's the demand? So we'll use certain high frequency indicators. Those high frequency indicators will take as a feedback and then further increase or decrease the allocation of MG Narega. So this is the concept of agile approach. Another example. Now, right now, as part of agile approach, we use number of high frequency indicators, which can include the GST tax collections, the toll collection on the national highways, the generation of e-way bills, the total consumption of electricity. So certain high frequency indicators are taken. Based upon those high frequency indicators, we start making changes to the policy. Now, for example, you must have heard that some of the economists have said that we are going to have K-shaped economic recovery, which means that some sectors are still yet to recover. These include sectors which are considered to be contact intensive, such as hotels, restaurants, and so on. Now, how will you know that these sectors are still affected? We'll get to know based upon the high frequency indicators. So based upon these high frequency indicators, we will give more amount of stimulus package to these adversely affected sectors. So can I say my response can be calibrated here? I can give certain stimulus to only certain specific sectors which are in need of stimulus. Some sectors which are already going, they don't need stimulus. Only these sectors need stimulus. And how is this possible? This is possible only when you follow the agile approach. Are you getting this point? Yes? Okay. So let's look at this. So this is the waterfall approach. So you can see the waterfall, right? Waterfall is like a step by step. Step by step, it's a linear approach. You understand the problem, you formulate the plan, implement the plan, and monitor the outcomes. Feedback loop may exist. I'm repeating, feedback loop may exist in the waterfall approach, but it is not very strong. In case of the agile approach, as you can see, it's a circular approach. Every time the plans are getting reformulated based upon the feedback. Further, in order to make your understanding much more easier so that you can have a look at it later also, I have incorporated this particular table. Can you see this particular table? All of you? So I have incorporated the differences between the waterfall approach and the agile approach with examples as well. I don't think UPSC could ask you a question with respect to the agile approach in the mains examination. But in case if you have to write an answer in the UPSC mains examination, and if you get an opportunity to use agile approach as a fodder point, you could incorporate this. Okay. Okay. Now coming to the barbell strategy. Let's understand the barbell strategy here. So first one is the agile approach. Second one is the barbell strategy. So what is barbell? See, barbell is the one which is used for weight lifting in the gyms. Can you see this? It's a barbell. And this barbell strategy, it is used in the finance. It is basically used for investments, for making investments. So let's first understand as to what is barbell strategy in the field of finance and how this barbell strategy the government has adopted for making of policies in India. We'll extend that later. So let's first understand as to what is a barbell strategy in finance. Now, for example, let's say I'm an investor and let's say I have a surplus cash of 1 lakh rupees. So I have 1 lakh rupees surplus cash, which I would want to make investment. I have two options. Option number one is the entire 1 lakh rupees I can make investment in certain safe assets. Safe assets such as I can make investment in fixed deposits, I can make investment in government securities or the bonds. Now, what is the benefit of making this entire investment of 1 lakh this side, left hand side? Benefit here is my investments are going to be safe, right? My investments are safe. But what is the challenge here? The problem. Since these investments are safe, can I say they will give me low returns? Are you getting this point? They will give me low returns if I make this entire 1 lakh rupees investment this side. Let's look at option number two. Option number two is, let's say I'm a very aggressive investor. I'm a very aggressive investor, and this entire 1 lakh rupees, I have made investment in certain high risk assets, which could be like shares, cryptocurrencies, futures, and options. Now, what is my benefit here? Benefit is, can I say I'm going to make high returns from these investments, right? High returns. But what is the problem or the challenge? The problem here is that my assets are very, very risky. What if the stock market crashes? I will lose my entire investment in share. What if the entire Bitcoin or Ethereum in which I've invested, the crash, I lose investment, right? So I have 1 lakh rupees and I have two options. Either I can invest that side at the extreme end, or I can invest this side at the extreme end. Now tell me, just think, how should I make investment then? Should I make my investment this side or should I make investment this side? Now the idea is to have a kind of diversified assets. That's what we keep saying, right? So normally it's being said, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Have a diversified portfolio. So what will I do is, out of this 1 lakh rupees, I will make some investment this side, say 50% this side, and 50% I'll make investment this side. So what happens is, even though I'm making low returns here, this side, but this low returns will get compensated by high returns this side. Similarly, this side, my assets are risky, but I'm compensating this by investing in certain safe assets. I hope you're getting this point, right? So this is how you diversify. But the question is, do you always keep this as 50-50? No, right? You will change it according to market dynamics. You will change it according to market dynamics. For example, let's say the share market is booming. When everything is going good, slowly what you will do, you will rebalance your portfolio. Certain amount of money you will take from this side and put it this side so that you can make more returns. Similarly, as soon as you start feeling that there is a kind of asset bubble, stock market can crash anytime, what will you do? Slowly you will start taking out money from this side and start putting this side. Are you getting this point? So this is a barbell strategy which is used in investment portfolio. The economic survey says that the government has also used this barbell strategy when it comes to policy making. How? Let's understand that. Can I say the barbell strategy has 2 legs? It has got 2 legs. Both are at the extreme ends. So if you look at this leg of barbell strategy, what are we doing here? In this leg of barbell strategy, we are making investment in certain safe assets, right? Why are we making investment in safe assets? Because we want to protect ourselves from negative outcomes in future. What if the entire stock market crashes? We have to have some kind of asset this side, right? So similarly, what the government does is, in order to prevent any kind of negative outcomes in future, which could have an impact on the people, the government will make certain safety nets for the people. So this leg is providing safety net, safety. This side, if you see, can I say the investor is very aggressive? He's very aggressive. He is trying to make more returns, high returns. So how will government make high returns here? Government will make policies. Government will make policies to make high returns. How will it make policies this side? This side, in order to have high returns, it will make policies based upon the agile approach. Are you getting this point? It will make policies based upon the agile approach. Apart from that, remember I also told you, the post-COVID world, it is going to be different from the pre-COVID world, right? So don't you think India should be preparing for the post-COVID world right now itself? Don't you think we have to promote Atmanirbhar Bharat? We have to promote adoption of technology. So where will you do that? We will do this as part of this agile approach. Are you getting this point? So agile approach is used for 2 things. 1, to deal with the uncertainties which are caused due to COVID, and 2, to prepare India for the post-COVID world. 2 things. And this side, what are we doing? We are providing safety nets for the people. Are we clear on this? So if you see, this side, you have safety nets for the poor and vulnerable sections. And this side, you have the agile approach, which is based on certain 80 high frequency indicators, which is bank credit, sale of automobiles, GST tax collections, e-way bills, the electricity consumption, and so on. So if you look at this side, safety nets, here, all of these are the safety nets which the government has provided for the poor and vulnerable sections. See, all of these things are very, very factual. And since they are very factual, it's meaningless for me to discuss these things. But at the same time, what we are going to do is, we are going to release the Prelims Compass 2021 on the budget and the economic survey. So in the Prelims Compass of budget and economic survey, we will discuss or highlight these things in much greater detail. They are very factual. There's no need for me to explain this. In case if you have any doubts, you can very well ask me also. So these are the safety nets. So probably if you get a question in the mains examination as to what kind of safety nets the government has provided for the people belonging to poor and vulnerable sections to deal with the COVID-19, you could incorporate this as a further points, right? My focus is on this side, agile approach. This is the most important part. And that one important aspect about this agile approach is India's unique strategy to focus on the supply side measures. Now, this is very, very important. In fact, I think last week on Friday or Saturday, the finance minister had made a statement in the parliament also highlighting to what extent India's response to COVID was different from the advanced economies. In case you have read newspaper, Hindu newspaper, it was there on the front page, probably on Friday or Saturday last week, I'm not very sure. So let's understand as to in what way India's strategy to deal with the COVID is different. Let's understand that. See, when COVID-19 affected the entire global economy, can I say the COVID has led to contraction in both demand as well as supply? It has led to contraction in both demand and supply. And that is why we keep saying that the COVID-19 has led to twin shocks to the Indian economy. That is what we keep saying, right? Now, let's understand what advanced economies have done and how India's response is different to this twin shocks to the economy. Now, please focus here. There was contraction in demand, there was contraction in supply, right? Now, what the developed economies did is, they did not give much emphasis on the supply side measures. They did not give focus on supply side measures. What did they instead do? They give more amount of focus on the demand side measures. So as part of demand side measures, these countries adopted fiscal stimulus policies. So you must be knowing the US Fed Bank adopted quantitative easing. Rate of interest was almost reduced to 0, right? Not just that, these countries, advanced economies, they provided for handouts to the people. Direct benefits transfer of huge amount of money to the people. So just look at this part. Demand and supply both have got contracted. You're not concentrating on the supply. You are focusing only on the demand. You're trying to increase the consumption. You're putting money directly into the pockets of people. Demand will start increasing, right? Demand will start increasing. But has the supply also increased commensurately? Has the supply increased commensurately? Not. Why? Even today, there are global supply chain disruptions. Are you getting this point? So obviously, demand has increased. There's no question about it. But supply has not increased on a commensurate level. So demand is here, supply is here. Can I say demand supply mismatch? When demand supply mismatch takes place, what happens? High rate of inflation. So if you look at US, in US, the rate of inflation is more than 6.5%. You must be wondering, what if India mein to hamesha hota rehta hai 6.5%? But why it is special is US is facing at an inflation rate which is highest in the last 40 years. So last 40-year high rate of inflation of more than 6.5% is what US is facing. Why? Demand supply mismatch. Because the advanced economies focus only on the demand, not on the supply. Are we getting this point? As far as advanced economies is concerned. Now let's look at India's unique response. Now this is quite interesting. COVID-19 took place, supply got reduced, demand got reduced. But just think very, very carefully and tell me, between supply and demand, which was the first one to get affected? Between supply and demand, which was the first one to get affected? I'm not saying that both are not got affected. I'm saying both are got affected. But which one is the first one to get affected? Supply side, right? Why the supply side got affected? Why supply got affected? Supply got affected because we imposed lockdown, because we imposed travel restrictions, because there was global supply chain disruptions. So it was initially, it was supply which got infected and not the demand. So what should be our initial focus? Initial focus should be on demand or supply? Initial focus should be on increasing the supply of goods and services. I very well remember this point also. When COVID-19 took place, first wave of COVID-19, when government announced Atmanirbhar Bharat package, the first package, there were a lot of editorials in the newspaper, in the Hindu newspaper, in Business Line, and so on. What these editorials were saying is, look, in case of India, it is a consumption expenditure, which is a major driver. Why the government is not focusing on consumption expenditure, and why is it focusing on the supply side measures? There were a lot of editorials which is criticizing the government. Now, to be fair enough to the government, just go back to the first lockdown, when everything was under lockdown. Just imagine what would have happened if we had given money to the people, direct benefits transfer to the people when the lockdown was imposed, and not focus on the supply side measures. Can I say, when we had given handout to the people, direct benefits transfer to the people, directly in the pockets of people, suddenly the demand would have shot up. And the supply would have not increased, right? So don't you think whatever US is facing right now, the same thing would have happened in case of India? Are you getting this point? So India realized that between the demand and supply, it is a supply which has to be made, which has to be resumed as early as possible. We have to increase the supply of goods and services. So India predominantly focused on this side. So this was a main priority, one thing. So here, government knew that boosting demand without boosting supply would have led to inflation. That's the first point. Second point, if you see, supply side measures. India also took supply side measures like investment in infrastructure. Now, can I say, when the government is making investment in infrastructure, it has a potential to lift both supply and demand, right? It has a potential to lift both supply and demand. So that's the second point. Third point is very important. Remember, what is Agile Approach? Agile Approach is two things. One, to deal with the uncertainties caused due to COVID. Second, to prepare India for the post-COVID world, to make Indian economy more resilient, more flexible, to innovate. To make Indian economy more flexible, more innovation, should we focus on demand side or supply side? Supply side, right? Once again. So these are some of the reasons as to why India focus on supply side measures and not purely on the demand side measures. So this is India's unique strategy as far as dealing with the COVID-19 is concerned. Are we clear now, all of you? Okay. So now let's understand as to what kind of supply side measures the government has undertaken. So look at the supply side measures. Supply side measures broadly can be categorized into two parts, that is flexibility and innovation, and improving the resilience of Indian economy. So some of the supply side measures include the labor reforms in India, MSME sector, financial sector, investment, telecommunication sector, industry, defense, and so on. So here, if I start discussing each of these topics in detail, each of these topics would further take half an hour each. For example, if I start discussing about the labor codes, it will take me almost like 30 to 40 minutes. If I'm discussing about revised definition of MSMEs, it will take me another 15 to 20 minutes. So what I have done here is, I have incorporated the DNS videos in which we have covered these topics in much greater detail. And most of these DNS videos have been covered by me only, most of these videos. So if you look at the labor reforms, in case of labor reforms, I've discussed everything what you need to know as far as the labor reforms, such as what are the problems with the labor laws in India, how labor laws have adversely affected the manufacturing sector, and critical analysis of 4 labor codes. That is, what are the benefits, challenges, and what should be done in future as far as the 4 labor codes is concerned. Similarly, I have also discussed about the Factoring Regulation Amendment Bill 2021. You can see the screenshot here. So this was covered in DNS video of 30th of July 2021. So in this particular video, I have discussed. So in this particular video, I've discussed as to what is factoring, what is reverse factoring, the concept of the trades platform, how this particular bill is going to benefit the MSME sector. So all of these aspects I have already covered. So in case if any of you are not gone through that point, please go through those points, these topics. Apart from that, you need not worry also, because all of these topics I will be covering once again as part of the revision classes. Okay. So as it is, you'll be having the revision classes as part of QIP. In those revision classes, I will be covering all of these topics. So since these topics have already been covered, I don't want to cover them once again. Let's focus on the other topics which are not being covered so far. That is my idea. Clear? Okay. Now coming to the next part. Next part is whatever I discussed in the first 1 hour. This was more of a kind of an introduction to the economic survey as to understanding the and decoding the theme of the economic survey. Some of these points can be used as fodder points, such as the Agile Approach, Barbell Strategy. Similarly, you can also discuss about India's unique strategy as far as dealing with the COVID is concerned. Now we are switching our mode. Now we are completely switching to prelims mode now. We are completely switching to prelims mode. And how are we going to approach the economic survey? Remember what the government has adopted this year? Agile approach, right? So what is Agile approach? Agile approach, you continuously take a feedback and fine tune your preparation. Similarly, as far as the economic surveys discussion is concerned, what we are going to do is, since the economic survey is very voluminous, it is very bulky, it is contained a lot of facts and figures, we will fine tune it according to the requirements of the UPSC examination. How? Based upon the feedback of the previous year questions. So we look at the previous year questions, which could have been answered from the economic survey. Based upon the analysis of such kind of questions, we'll take a feedback and try to understand as to what aspects of economic survey becomes important for your upcoming prelims examination. Are you clear now? So if you look at the question asked in prelims 2019, we had this question with respect to purchasing power parity and size of India in terms of its GDP size, that is PPP dollars, purchasing power parity. Next question in prelims 2017, as you can see, we had a question with respect to the broad trends in various indicators, like share of agriculture, share of India's exports, FDI inflows, India's foreign exchange reserves. And if you look at the question asked in prelims 2015, this was a question related to the trends in both real GDP as well as nominal GDP. Next, so based upon this, what can you know? Here broadly, you must understand the general trends as far as the macroeconomic indicators is concerned. No need to mug up any facts, any figures. See, I have incorporated a lot of facts and figures in my discussion. My idea of incorporating the facts and figures was to make it more clear to you. The idea is not to ensure that you mug up those data. Okay. So based upon the analysis of the previous year question paper, let's look at the important points. Look at the first point. Here we had a question as to what is the size of India in terms of PPP dollars, purchasing power parity, right? So here, look at this particular graph, this particular table. This graph here shows the entire world economy in this particular shape. And this size of world GDP as on December 2021, it was $94 trillion. So if you add up the nominal GDP of all the countries across the world, how much it was? $94 trillion in December 2021. And if you look at the ranking of the countries, US GDP size is how much? $22 trillion. First ranked country. It is followed by China, Japan, Germany, UK, and India. Please focus this side. What is India's GDP size? $2.9 trillion. One thing I want to highlight here, last to last year, that is 2 years back, India was placed at 5th position in terms of the total GDP size. But now India has slipped from 5th to 6th place. Remember that, more than sufficient from the perspective of prelims. I hope you are clear now. So India's GDP size is approximately $2.9 trillion. This is in terms of nominal GDP. And India contributes how much? 3% to the world's GDP. So remember this, that is more than sufficient. As far as US is concerned, its contribution is almost like 24%. You can see here. Next point. Okay, please have a look at this graph. Now, this particular graph here shows the trends in both real GDP as well as nominal GDP in absolute values. I'm not discussing in terms of the growth rates. I'm discussing in terms of absolute values. Green color shows the real GDP. Blue color shows the nominal GDP. Now, please focus until these two, until this point. So can I say from 2016-17 to 2019-20, every year my real GDP was increasing in terms of absolute value? Yes. In terms of absolute value, my real GDP was increasing. My nominal GDP was also increasing. That is before 2019-20. Then in the COVID year, both real GDP as well as nominal GDP contracted. Yes. And in this year, 21-22, both real GDP as well as nominal GDP, they have come back to the pre-COVID levels. Don't mug up the data. Don't remember anything. Three things you have to remember. One, nominal GDP and real GDP, both were increasing in terms of absolute value before the COVID. On account of COVID, there was contraction, both in real GDP as well as nominal GDP. After the COVID, both real GDP and nominal GDP have reached the pre-COVID levels, more than sufficient. Are we clear? Okay. Apart from that, I hope you already know the concept of GVA, GVA at basic price. So GDP, it can be measured at three levels: GDP at factor cost, GDP at basic price, which is also referred to as GVA at basic price, and GDP at market price. So when you look at GDP at basic price or GVA at basic price, even GDP or GVA at basic price has also reached a pre-pandemic level. Understand that part. So if you want to understand about factor cost, basic price and market price, recently this video, I think we have conducted this class also, in which I discussed about how the GDP can be calculated at different level. So this is a video in which I have discussed this. Now coming to the trends in the growth rates, GDP growth rates. Now please focus here. This is the real GDP and this is the nominal GDP. Please focus until this year. Now can I say here, my real GDP was continuously declining before the COVID. My nominal GDP growth rate was also continuously declining before the COVID. Look, then what happened? Further contraction, both in real GDP and nominal GDP. Why I'm stressing on this is, most of us know that the GDP growth rate contracted to minus 7.2%. But we know this only in terms of real GDP. People don't know about the nominal GDP. So UPSC could target that part. UPSC could target as to whether the nominal GDP growth rate has, contracted or not. So that is why I have highlighted this. So even the nominal GDP growth rate has also got contracted. So please remember this. And now both these two have come back to pre-pandemic levels. So what should we know here? One, there was deceleration in both real GDP as well as nominal GDP before COVID. When COVID took place, both real GDP as well as nominal GDP growth rate, they registered negative growth rates. Both. And then after the COVID, there is a sharp V-shaped recovery, both in terms of real GDP and nominal GDP. Are we clear? Okay. So you have two practice questions. So just like last time, I've incorporated the practice questions as part of the quiz. So the link to the quiz will be shared with you after the end of the class as well as during the class. So you can attempt these questions. Most of the questions you'll be able to answer based upon our discussion. Okay. Okay. Now coming to share of different drivers of the Indian economy. So you already know the basics. When you calculate the GDP by expenditure method, you take into account four important drivers, which is private final consumption expenditure, government final consumption expenditure, gross capital formation, and the net exports. So these are the four major drivers. Out of this, if you look at the private final consumption expenditure, PFCE, so this is my private final consumption expenditure. So here, as you can see, there are 3 different years, right? Focus on this advanced estimates of 21-22. And how much is this? This is approximately equal to 57%. So this is our major driver. The second major driver happens to be the gross fixed capital formation, which is approximately 30%. The third one is the government final consumption expenditure, which is around 12%. And last is the net exports, which is calculated as exports minus imports. Now, this is one thing which I would want to highlight once again. Look at the total value of exports and imports for India. How much it is? If you add up my exports and imports, how much it is? 20 plus 23. So this is 43%. And this we call it as trade to GDP ratio. So trade to GDP ratio of India is how much? 43%. I'll ask you a simple question. If I compare trade to GDP ratio of India with that of China, between these two countries, which country's trade to GDP ratio do you think is higher? Anyone? If I compare trade to GDP ratio of India with China, which country's trade to GDP ratio would be higher? I can see most of you are giving me the answer as China, but I'll give a very surprising thing. It is India whose trade to GDP ratio is higher than that of China. Why? When you say trade to GDP ratio, what are we doing? You're adding up your total imports plus total exports. So total trade to GDP ratio of India is like 43%. For China, I guess 1.5 years back, the trade to GDP ratio of China was 35%, 35 to 36%. Now, why am I stressing on this? Because this was an important fact which was highlighted by one of the previous year's economic survey. It was highlighted in one of the previous year's economic survey. That is why I'm highlighting this. So please remember this point. Okay. And if you look at the net exports for India, how do you calculate it? Total exports minus imports. And normally in case of India, you know, our imports are more than the exports. So that is why my net exports is in negative, -3. Are we clear? Okay. So please remember this important fact. Trade to GDP ratio of India is higher than that of China. Clear? Okay, this is once again very interesting topic. See, most of us know as to what is gross capital formation, GCF. And we know that gross capital formation is a gross investment. But what we don't know is the components of the gross capital formation. How do we actually measure gross capital formation? So if you look at the components of gross capital formation, that is gross investment, it has basically 3 components. Component number 1 is gross fixed capital formation. Component number 2 is changes in inventories, and component number 3 is the valuables. Let me explain these components one by one. Coming to the first one, gross fixed capital formation. Here, whatever money you are investing in creation of assets, such as roads, railways, ports, airports, etc., plus the money which is used for buying of machinery and equipment. That is the second one. Third one, this is very important. The money that you make investment in research and development, even that is part of my gross fixed capital formation. This is based upon the system of national accounts 2008. So it's an international standard. It's an international standard which has been laid down by international institutions such as United Nations, IMF, World Bank, etc. And India has adopted this system of national accounts. And whatever money that we are investing in research and development, we consider this as part of gross capital formation. Next one, this is very interesting. Please focus here. Cultivated biological resources. What do you mean by cultivated biological resources? One, it includes the livestock, plus it includes the plantation crops. So even these two are taken into account. So let me explain this. Now look at livestock. Say, for example, cows. Now, can I say if a farmer is buying a cow, that cow becomes an asset for him? Why? Because the cow will continuously keep on giving milk to him, which will in turn help him to increase his income level, right? So livestock is an asset because it gives you continuous returns. So what we do in order to measure this cultivated biological resources is, let's say last year, we had totally 100 cattle. And this year, the total number of cattle in India have increased to 120. How much is the increment in terms of cattle? I can say that there is 20 new cattle, right? So this 20 new cattle, we consider this as part of our gross fixed capital formation. Increment in livestock. Increment in livestock, it is part of gross fixed capital formation. Similarly, increment in my plantation crops also is considered as part of gross capital formation. What are plantation crops? Plantation crops could be orchards, that is horticulture orchards. It could be tea, coffee, rubber, etc. Now, for example, let's say last year we had, say, for example, 100 mango trees. And this year, the number of mango trees has increased to, say, 130. So what is the total number of increment in the mango trees? 130. Sorry, 30 here. 30 is the total increment. So this 30 here is a new investment in the plantation. So this 30 will be added up to my gross fixed capital formation. So please remember this. Could be asked in the UPSC Prelims examination as to which among the following are the components of the gross capital formation. So even research and development and cultivated biological resources are also used for the gross fixed capital formation. Now this is very interesting. Changes in inventories. Please focus here. Let's say in a particular year, we have manufactured 100 markers. Out of these 100 markers, 90 markers get sold and 10 markers remain unsold. I repeat, out of 100 markers which are manufactured in a year, 90 markers get sold and 10 markers remain unsold. Now those 90 markers which are sold in the economy, can I say they will get accounted under private final consumption expenditure, PFC? So whatever markers are sold, they will be accounted as part of PFC, sold markers, something which is sold. Now what happens to the unsold ones? What happens to the remaining 10 markers here? What happens to the remaining 10 markers is we put them in the inventories, changes in inventories. So these changes in inventories, that is in this case 10 markers, they will obviously be added up to my GDP. They will be added up to my GDP. And you see here, when you measure GDP, you're taking into account the gross fixed capital formation, right? So this gross fixed capital formation also includes the changes in inventories. So these 10 markers will be added to the changes in inventories and they will be calculated as part of my GDP. So please understand, all the goods which are sold in all the goods which are manufactured in a particular year, all the goods will be accounted as part of my GDP. Those goods which are sold, that become part of private final consumption expenditure. Those goods which remain unsold, they become part of changes in inventories. This is one point. Now, this is another interesting thing, valuables. Now, let's say you're buying gold, gems, jewelry, etc. Now, gold, gems, jewelry, when you buy, don't you think ideally it should be part of private final consumption expenditure, PFC? But the way it is accounted, whenever people buy gold, gems, jewelry, it is not accounted under private final consumption expenditure. It is accounted under the gross capital formation. Please remember that. So some important prelims related aspect which I discussed is that research and development, cultivated biological resources are part of the gross capital formation. Changes in inventories. So all the goods which remain unsold in a particular year, they will be considered as part of the GDP, but we will be accounting them as part of changes in inventories. And people's expenditure on valuables, that is not part of private final consumption expenditure, rather it is part of the gross capital formation. Are we clear now? So now have a look at this. Look at the gross capital formation, the trends. See, usually you need to know the trends, broad trends in the last 10 years. So here, if you see, in the year 2010-11, my gross capital formation was how much? 40%. From 40%, the gross capital formation has got reduced to how much? 31%. So there has been decline in terms of my gross capital formation. First point, as far as prelims examination is concerned. Second, if you see, when you look at gross fixed capital formation, who are the two entities which are contributing to the gross fixed capital formation? Public, that is government, and the private. Between these two, whose share is higher in the gross capital formation? The share of private investment is higher than the public investment. Remember this, because these days we are talking a lot about investment. So remember that the private investment as of now, it is higher than the public investment. As far as share of changes in stocks is concerned and valuables is concerned, it is quite marginal. So these are some things as far as your gross capital formation is concerned. Next is gross domestic savings. So when you look at gross domestic savings, look at the entities which are contributing to the gross domestic savings. It is the household sector, private corporate sector, and the public sector. That is basically different government agencies and so on, which save money with the banks and so on, right? So these are the three entities which are providing for the gross domestic savings. And the total savings as such, it is 31.5%. And it has declined in the last 1 decade. So there is decline in the overall gross domestic savings from 37 to 31.5%. So my gross capital formation as well as gross domestic savings, both have got declined. And out of the different entities, which entity is contributing highest? The household sector is contributing highest. So almost 2/3 of my savings are contributed by the household. Only the remaining 1/3 is contributed by the private corporate sector and the public sector. Apart from that, if you look at the household savings can be in two types: physical savings and the financial savings. When you say physical savings is in terms of savings in land, buildings, etc. So they are considered as savings. Financial savings can be in form of fixed deposits, mutual funds, shares, and so on. And between these two savings, please remember that the physical savings is higher than the financial savings. Remember this part. Okay. So here, as you can see, to make your work easier, I have incorporated all the prelims pointers. So these are the prelims pointers which you can remember. Okay, then next you have certain practice questions, which I am very sure you should be able to attempt based upon our discussion. Okay, now coming to the last part of this particular chapter, that is trends in terms of different sectors of the economy. So here, as far as economic survey is concerned, it has given us the details of the trends in the contribution of different sectors only for the last 3 years. And it is not really helpful from the perspective of the prelims examination, because UPSC is not going to ask you the trends only for last 2 to 3 years. So this chart, which is provided in the economic survey, is not helpful as far as your exam preparation is concerned. So once again, to make your preparation more exam friendly, I have incorporated this. So if at all UPSC will ask you a question, UPSC will ask you a question with respect to the trends in the last 10 years, 1 decade. Don't worry, this is from the official data, that is National Statistical Office, right? So here, let's look at the trends in terms of contribution of different sectors, starting with the agriculture. Now look at the contribution of the agriculture sector. Can I say broadly, the contribution of the agriculture sector has remained stagnant at 18%. Almost it has remained stagnant except for 1 year when its share had increased to 20%. Otherwise, it has remained stagnant at 18%. Among the agriculture sector, which subsector contributes highest? It is the crops. This contributes for the highest share. Secondly, if you look at industry, now this is very important from the perspective of prelims. When you say industry in case of India, What are its subsectors? Industrial sector includes mining, manufacturing, electricity, gas, water supply, and utility services, and construction. So all of this together we refer to as industry. And look at the contribution of the industrial sector. Can I say the share of the industrial sector has declined from 32% to 25%? Very important. In the last 1 year, the share of agriculture sector has remained stagnant, whereas the share of the industrial sector has got reduced. In particular, please focus on the share of the manufacturing sector. Can I say the share of the manufacturing sector has remained stagnant at 16 to 17% of GDP? 16 to 17%. In fact, the share of the manufacturing sector has remained stagnant since 1991 economic reforms. It has been stagnant at 16 to 17%. And as far as services is concerned, please have a look at the share of services. You can see the share of services sector has increased from 49% to 54%. So these are the broad trends. So all of these aspects have highlighted in the prelims pointers. To make your work easier, this is once again the same graph, which is much better represented. So this will help you to remember important aspects as far as trends in contribution of different sectors is concerned. Then you have certain practice questions. Look at practice question number 7. The share of the agriculture sector in the GDP has declined in the last decade. The share of the industrial sector in GDP has increased in the last decade. The contribution of service sector to GDP has increased in the last decade. Now we know that share of the agriculture sector has not declined, it has remained stagnant. Now just think, if you have come across the same question in the actual prelims examination, what would have been your response? You would have thought, share of the agriculture sector, yes, it may have reduced in the last 1 decade. Share of industrial sector would have increased. That would have been our normal response. But if you look at the reality is completely different. Share of the agriculture sector has remained stagnant, whereas the share of the industrial sector has declined. And the share of the services sector has increased. I hope we are clear now. Okay. Okay, now we are done with the first chapter of the economic survey. Now we are going to move to the second chapter, that is the chapter of public finance. So once again here, as far as this particular chapter is concerned, we are going to approach this particular chapter purely from the perspective of the prelims examination. Those things which are important from the perspective of prelims, those things we are going to discuss. So let's start our discussion. So you have certain practice questions, which I'm pretty sure you must be able to attempt it. Okay, the first one. The first one is with respect to types of fiscal policies. What are the types of fiscal policies? So it's the most basic thing that you need to know before understanding about the public finance. I hope most of you must have heard about 2 types of fiscal policies: fiscal stimulus and fiscal consolidation. Fiscal stimulus policy is adopted during times of recession. So during recession, as part of fiscal stimulus, the government will reduce the tax rates and increase the expenditure so as to inject more money into the economy. Fiscal consolidation is adopted when there is a high rate of inflation. And as part of fiscal consolidation, the government will increase the tax rates and reduce the expenditure. So as you can see, we had seen this question asked in prelims 2016 as to what steps the government will take to reduce the budget deficit, which is nothing but fiscal consolidation. Similarly, in prelims 2021, we had this question as to which among the following steps is most likely to be taken at the time of economic recession. So it's more about the fiscal stimulus, right? So most of you, I'm pretty sure, would have studied about fiscal stimulus and fiscal consolidation. But what I'm going to discuss now is the difference in fiscal policies between pro-cyclical and counter-cyclical fiscal policy. That is more important. So, see, we keep talking about business cycles, right? There are 2 types of business cycle. One is a recessionary business cycle, and the other one is the inflationary business cycle. So, pro-cyclical fiscal policy is a kind of fiscal policy which is in line with the business cycle, which means rather than countering the business cycle, the pro-cyclical fiscal policy will further prolong the business cycle. On the other hand, counter-cyclical fiscal policy, it will counter the business cycle. So if the business cycle is recessionary, it will try to promote growth. If the business cycle is inflationary, it will try to bring down the inflation. Example, let's understand this. I hope all of you are able to see this screen, right? So concentrate on this. Let's say the business cycle is recessionary. And if you have to come out of recession, what should you do? You should inject more money into the economy, right? So here, if you want to come out of the recession, money supply in the economy would have to increase. So here, what counter-cyclical policy will do? It will counter this recession, which means it will help the economy to come out of the recession. How? By increasing the money supply. How will government increase the money supply? Government will reduce the tax rates and government will increase the expenditure. So that money supply will increase and we will be able to promote growth and development. Now, when you look at pro-cyclical fiscal policy, it is in line with the cycle. It will not counter the cycle. What we have to do to come out of recession? Money supply should increase. But rather than increasing the money supply, it will end up reducing the money supply. Rather than increasing, it will end up reducing the money supply. For example, as part of pro-cyclical policy, the government may end up increasing the tax rates or reduce expenditure, because of which the recession will get further prolonged. Similarly, if you see this side, inflation, this is another business cycle. This inflation is because of higher money supply. So if you have to counter inflation, what should happen here? Money supply in the economy should reduce. So here, what counter-cyclical policy will do? It will increase the tax rates, reduce expenditure, and hence money supply is reducing and we will be able to reduce the inflation. But pro-cyclical fiscal policy, rather than reducing the money supply, it will end up increasing the money supply. For example, it will reduce the tax rates, it will increase the expenditure, and this will become pro-cyclical. Now, two things are important. First and foremost, see, most of the students think that counter-cyclical policy can be adopted only when there is a recession. This is not true. Counter-cyclical fiscal policy can be adopted both during recession as well as high rate of inflation. That's the first point. Second point, the counter-cyclical fiscal policy can lead to either an increase or decrease in money supply, depending upon the business cycle. If the business cycle is recessionary and if you have adopted counter-cyclical, money supply will increase. If the business cycle is inflationary and if you have adopted counter-cyclical, money supply will reduce. Are you getting this point? Now, please have a look at this question. Practice question number 15. What do you think is the answer? Quickly. Practice question number 15. With respect to counter-cyclical fiscal policy, consider the following statements. What do you think is the answer? All of you. So look at the statement here. First statement, counter-cyclical policy can be adopted to promote economic growth when the economy is facing recession. We have seen this already. When the economy is facing recession, counter-cyclical fiscal policy can be adopted to promote growth. So the first statement here is correct. Second statement is, upon the adoption of this policy, the money supply always increases. Does it always increase? I told you very clearly that whether the money supply will increase or decrease, that depends upon when you have adopted the counter-cyclical policy. If counter-cyclical policy has been adopted during recession, money supply will increase. But if counter-cyclical fiscal policy is adopted during high rate of inflation, the money supply will reduce. So that is why this statement here is incorrect. The first option is right. Similarly, look at this practice question. Which among the following measures are not likely to be taken by the government as part of fiscal stimulus policy? Not likely. This is a practice question which I think that you would be able to answer as part of the quiz. Clear? Okay, now coming to the snapshot of government's finances. So here, let's first look at the nature of questions asked in the previous year prelims. So as you can see in prelims 2018, we had this question as to how the government borrows money. So there was a question related to government securities. Prelims 2019, we had a question related to India's external debt. That is, you need to know the debt status of the government or entire Indian economy. Third, as you can see in prelims 2016, we had a question related to FRBM Act and its targets. So you need to know about the FRBM Act from the perspective of prelims. Prelims 2017, we had this question related to trends in tax to GDP ratio and trends in fiscal deficit. So you must understand the broad trends in various macroeconomic indicators. Prelims 2015, we had a question related to 14th Finance Commission. So you need to understand the recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission. This becomes important from the perspective of your prelims. Prelims 2015, we had a question related to tax to GDP ratio. So you need to understand the implications of the different aspects of the government's finances. So let's start our discussion. So we have seen the nature of questions asked in the previous year prelims. So based upon that, let's broadly understand the government's finances, starting with the budget size. The total budget size of the government in the year 21-22 is 37.5 lakh crores. Now, before discussing this figures, one thing I need to make it very, very clear to you. When you look at the economic survey data is from April to November. Economic survey provides data from April to November, whereas budget provides us a data from April 1st to March 31st. This is the estimates. So between these two, which data or which trend should you follow? This budget gives us a trend for the entire year. So you should follow the budget rated data because it is more updated in comparison to the economic survey. So if you look at the second chapter of the economic survey, even in second chapter of the economic survey, they'll discuss about trends in tax to GDP ratio, trends in share of direct and indirect taxes. I'm not saying that it is wrong. I'm just saying that it is not updated. It is only until April to November. So from where should you study about the trends in tax to GDP ratio, shares of direct and indirect taxes? Not from the economic survey. You should study that from the budget because it provides us the details. Are we clear now? So next time when you're revising economic survey, don't revise the economic survey chapter of public finance, the data. Just go to the discussion which I'm doing here. Okay. Apart from that, I also told you that budget gives us the details of receipts and expenditure for 3 financial years. That is the previous financial year, the present financial year, and the next financial year. The question is, out of these 3 financial years, which financial year should you focus upon? You should focus upon the present financial year. That is 21-22. Are we clear now? Right? So let's understand these points. So if you look at the total budget size, it is 37.5 lakh crores. What do you mean by budget size? Let's understand that. You know the budget has 2 components, revenue budget and capital budget, right? Apart from that, you know that you have revenue receipts and capital receipts. So if you add up your revenue receipts and capital receipts, the total receipts of the government, that is how much? 37.5 lakh crores. Similarly, when you look at the government's expenditure, that is revenue expenditure and capital expenditure put together, that is 37.5 lakh crores. So must have repeatedly studied that the budget in case of India is a balanced budget. Why do you call it as balanced budget? Because receipts are equal to the expenditure. My receipts are equal to 37.5 lakh crore. My expenditure is also 37.5 lakh crores. Let's understand these things. So here Can you see this? Revenue account and the capital account. Please have a look at the revenue receipts. How much it is? 20.5 lakh crores. Look at my capital receipts, 17 lakh crores. 20.5 plus 17, how much it is? 37.5 lakh crores. Look at my capital expenditure, 6 lakh crores. Look at my revenue expenditure, 31.5 lakh crore. That's added up to 37.5 lakh crore. That is why we say the budget in case of India is a balanced budget. Now, in the revenue account, you have receipts and the expenditure. And please have a look at the receipts part. In the first part, you have the gross tax revenue. Gross tax revenue is how much? 25 lakh crores. And here, it is considered to be at 10.8% of GDP. Now, can you guess, when we say this GDP, is it the real GDP or nominal GDP? Anyone? When we say it is percentage of GDP, which GDP are we referring to? The real GDP or nominal GDP? Always remember, when we express something in percentage of GDP, that GDP is always the nominal GDP. It's not the real GDP. Understand? GDP in default. So whenever you come across in the newspaper that GDP growth is so and so, by default, GDP means real GDP. But when we express something in terms of percentage of GDP, that GDP is the nominal GDP. Please remember this. So here, if you look at my nominal GDP, it is approximately around 230 lakh crores. It is 230 lakh crores. So you can convert 25 lakh crores in terms of percentage of 230 lakh crores. It will be approximately equal to 10.8%. Within the gross tax revenue, you have direct taxes and the indirect taxes. And please focus here. Share of direct and indirect taxes is almost same. Very important part. Share of direct taxes is 5.4. Share of indirect taxes is also 5.4. The share of direct and indirect taxes is almost same. And if you look at the order of different taxes, the tax which contributes for the highest share is GST. And when we say GST, here the GST will include only that part of GST which is collected by the center. Only that GST which is collected by the center, which includes the central GST, the union territory GST, and the GST compensation cess. It will not include the central GST. Please remember. Why? Because central GST is collected by the state government. So state government will include the state GST in their own budget. Okay. So the tax which contributes to the highest share is GST. It is followed by corporate tax. It is followed by the income tax. One thing I want to highlight here. Last year, the share of income tax was higher than the corporate tax last year. This time there is a reversal. This year, corporate tax share is higher and the income tax share is comparatively lower. Then you have union excise duty and the customs duty. So here, this is the total gross tax revenue. Okay. Now, please focus here. You have this total gross tax revenue which is collected by the center. This is a total revenue which is collected by the center. From this gross tax revenue, the central government will make transfer to the states. Certain amount of gross tax revenue is transferred to the states based upon the recommendations of the Finance Commission. You know that, right? Like 15 Finance Commission has recommended that 41% of the taxes collected by the center should have to be transferred to the states. So that 41% is deducted from the gross tax revenue. Apart from that, certain amount of money from the gross tax revenue is taken out and it is put under National Disaster Response Fund, NDRF. And you know this NDRF, it is part of the public account of India. It is not under consolidated fund. So if you deduct the transfer of taxes to the states and transfer to the NDRF account, whatever remains, that we call it as the net tax revenue. So you can look at the formula. Net tax revenue is gross tax revenue minus state share of taxes and transfer to NDRF. So you can see here, net tax revenue is how much? 17.5 lakh crore. Non-tax revenue is how much? 3 lakh crore. So if you add up these two, you get 20.5 lakh crores. Now coming to revenue expenditure, if you look at the revenue expenditure part, among the different components of revenue expenditure, the highest share is of the interest payment. And when you look at the capital receipts can be divided into debt receipts and non-debt receipts. And please have a look at our borrowings. How much it is? We have borrowed 16 lakh crores. So out of my total capital account receipts of 17 lakh crore, can you see how much is my borrowings? 16 lakh crores. Right? Now let's look at the important deficits. First and foremost, I hope you must have heard about revenue deficit, right? How do you calculate revenue deficit? Revenue deficit is calculated as revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. So the revenue deficit is 11 lakh crore, which is 4.7% of GDP. Effective revenue deficit. How do you calculate effective revenue deficit? Effective revenue deficit is calculated as revenue deficit minus the grants to the states for the creation of capital assets, minus this component. So this revenue deficit is 11 lakh crore. 11 lakh crore, 2.4 lakh crore, 8.6. So that is 3.7%. So remember the formula for the effective revenue deficit. Next is fiscal deficit, which is nothing but the total borrowings. And look at the borrowings, how much it is? 16 lakh crores. And then you have primary deficit. How is primary deficit calculated? It is calculated as fiscal deficit minus interest payments. So my fiscal deficit is 16 lakh crores. Out of which, how much is my interest payment? Please have a look at this. I have borrowed 16 lakh crores and my interest payment is how much? 8 lakh crores. How much is the money I'm left with? That is primary deficit. So primary deficit is 8 lakh crores. Last and most important is the concept of effective capital expenditure. Effective capital expenditure is the total money spent by the center on creation of assets. That is this part plus the grants to the states for creation of assets. That is this part. If you add up these two, you get the effective capital expenditure. Okay. So please have a look at the major source of income and expenditure. So first we have GST, followed by corporate tax, income tax, and excise duty. As far as my expenditure is concerned, major share is of interest payments, which accounts for highest. As I said, it is almost like 8 lakh crores, followed by state share of taxes. That is how much taxes the central transfer to the states, and central sector schemes. So these are the major expenses. Now look at the deficit trends. Now this is important here. Particularly focus on the fiscal deficit, FD. Now, can I say that my fiscal deficit from the year 2011-12, it was reducing until 2018-19. On a general level, this was reducing until 2018-19. But after 2018-19, it has continued to increase. Question is why? Because we know that after 2018-19, there was an economic slowdown. To counter the economic slowdown, the government had to borrow more amount of money, provide stimulus, right? So to provide stimulus, the government had to borrow money. The fiscal deficit has further increased. So now the fiscal deficit, it is at 6.9% of GDP. And the government has promised that it will be brought down to 6.4%. Okay. Now look at the trends in tax receipts, tax to GDP ratio. Please focus on the orange line, this line. And look at the last 7 to 8 years. As far as tax to GDP ratio is concerned, can you observe any kind of trends, whether it is increasing or decreasing? There's no observable trend as such. The tax to GDP ratio has been fluctuating. But broadly, what we know is the tax to GDP ratio has been fluctuating between 10% to 11% of GDP. Between 10 to 11%. And The next part, if you look at the tax to GDP, share of direct and indirect taxes, have a look at this. In the last 7 to 8 years, this is very important. Last 7 to 8 years, my share of direct taxes normally has been higher than the indirect taxes, normally, in most of the years. But at the same time, there were 2 years. There were 2 years when the share of direct taxes was equal to the indirect taxes. These 2 points are important. So, for example, if you see the year 2016-17, the share of direct and indirect taxes was almost 5.6. Similarly, now if you see, the share of direct and indirect taxes is 5.4. So generally the share of direct taxes has been higher than the indirect taxes. But for 2 years, the direct taxes has been equal to the indirect taxes. Now let's say you get a question in the prelims examination. The share of direct taxes has always been higher than the indirect taxes in the last 1 decade. What your answer would be? It would be wrong, right? Because there were 2 years where the share of direct and indirect taxes were same. Now coming to the fiscal deficit, borrowings of the government. So as I said, fiscal deficit represents to how much money the government is borrowing in a particular year. And for this year, we have borrowed 16 lakh crores. The question is, from where do we borrow money? So here, the borrowings of the government can be categorized as long-term borrowings and the short-term borrowings. When it comes to long-term borrowings, government borrows through the issuance of dated securities. Securities against National Small Savings Fund. Now, what is this? NSSF. So right now, the government is implementing a large number of small savings schemes, such as the post office deposits, Kisan Vikas Patra, National Small Savings Certificate, Sukanya Samriddhi account. So whatever money the government collects under these small savings schemes, all that money goes into National Small Savings Fund, NSSF. Certain amount of money from the National Small Savings Fund is in turn invested into government securities. So government is in a way borrowing money from where? From the National Small Savings Fund. So that is the second one. And third one is soaring gold bonds, soaring green bonds. They are also added up to my fiscal deficit. Please remember this, very important. Soaring gold bonds, soaring green bonds, which the government is going to issue as announced in the budget, they will be part of my fiscal deficit. But at the same time, I hope you must have heard about oil bonds. You must have heard about recap bonds, recapitalization bonds. Now, please understand, these oil bonds and recapitalization bonds, they are not considered for calculation of fiscal deficit. Please remember this. So some bonds such as oil bonds, recapitalization bonds, they are not part of the fiscal deficit. They will become part of the internal debt of the government. I will be discussing that later. Okay. Next is external borrowings, borrowings from external sources, receipts in the public account, and all of these, short term and long term. So now, if you see from where the government has borrowed this 16 lakh crores, the fiscal deficit, can you see this? Market borrowings, market borrowings. So the market borrowings of the government is approximately around 12 lakh crore. So the majority of the government's borrowing, fiscal deficit, is in the form of dated securities. So this is the highest share. Please remember this from the perspective of prelims examination. So the highest share of the fiscal deficit is from the dated securities, market borrowings. And second highest share is with respect to securities against National Small Savings Fund. Can you see this? This is the second highest share. So the first one is market borrowings. So this is the first one. And the second one is securities against the National Small Savings Fund. Okay, now look at the question. Practice question number 19. What do you think is the answer? Quickly. Which among the following components are deducted from the gross tax revenue to calculate the net tax revenue of the central government? What do you think is the answer? B. Answer is B. State share of taxes and transfer to NDRF. Look at this practice question number 20 quickly. Give me the answer. With reference to the present status of tax collection in India, consider the following statements. Answer is D, neither one nor two. Look at practice question number 21 quickly. Which among the following are included in the calculation of effective capital expenditure? All of you. Answer is B, 1 and 2 only. Look at practice question number 22. Which among the following account for the highest share of the government's expenditure? Practice question number 22. Yes, good. Answer is A, interest payments. Good. Look at practice question number 23. What do you think is the answer? Okay. Now, look at the first one. The fiscal deficit has consistently increased in the last decade? No. It initially reduced and then increased. We know for sure that this statement is wrong. The effective revenue deficit has been eliminated? No. So these two statements are perfectly wrong. So based upon the elimination, you'll get to know the right answer is B. Practice question number 24. Quickly. Which among the following best describe the concept of tax expenditure? What do you mean by tax expenditure? See, tax expenditure is basically the revenue foregone or revenue lost by the government because of tax exemptions. So whenever the government gives certain tax exemptions to companies, individuals, etc., so government loses out the revenue. So how much revenue the government loses out because of the tax exemption, that we call it as tax expenditure. Okay, now coming to the debt status of the government. Let's understand the debt status. So I've seen some of you are asking me about the debt status of the government, whether the government's debt has increased or not. So we are going to discuss that part. So now, if you see, with respect to debt status, in prelims 2019, we had a question related to India's external debt. So let's understand India's overall debt status. I hope all of you are able to see this. Please focus here. This is very important. Look at the total liabilities of the government. How much is the total liabilities? The total liabilities of the government is 135 lakh crores. And my total GDP size, nominal GDP, is 230 lakh crores. So my liabilities is 135 lakh crores. And how do you know the liabilities? How do you calculate the liabilities? The liabilities consist of two parts: public debt and the liabilities under the public account of India. And if you look at the total liabilities of the government, how much it is? 59% of the GDP, 59%. Out of which you have public debt and the liabilities under the public account of India. Public debt can be in turn categorized into two parts. Public debt has internal debt and external debt. Between these two, whose share is higher? The share of internal debt is higher than the external debt. Can you see this part? The internal debt is 49% of GDP. External debt is just 2% of GDP. See, when I'm talking about the external debt, I'm talking it from the perspective of the center. I'm not taking the entire external debt of the Indian economy. I'm saying this is the external debt of the center. In the internal debt, you have different components: treasury bills, cash management bills, ways and means advances, dated securities, which accounts for the highest share. And look at this part: oil bonds, recapitalization bonds, they are part of my internal debt. They do not become part of my fiscal deficit. Remember, I just told you that part. Oil bonds and recapitalization bonds, they are not part of my fiscal deficit, but they become part of my internal debt. Then securities against NSSF. Among all of this, the highest share is of the dated securities. In the external debt, you have loans from multilateral institutions and bilateral debt. Between these two, loans from the multilateral institution account for the higher share. So what all things should I remember from the perspective of prelims as far as this table is concerned? First thing you have to remember is, when we say total liabilities of the government, when we say this includes public debt and the liabilities under the public account of India. That's the first point. Second point, when I say public debt includes internal debt and the external debt. Second point. Third point, between my internal debt and external debt, the share of internal debt is higher. Third point. Fourth point, among my various sources of internal debt, dated securities account for the highest share. Next point. Under the external debt, loans from multilateral institutions account for the highest share. If you remember these things, more than sufficient. Clear? Apart from that, I hope you know about FRBM Act also, right? So under the FRBM Act, we have a target that the overall debt of the center should be brought down to 40% and the overall debt of the state should be brought down to 20%. This target is to be met by 31st of March 2025. This is a target under the FRBM Act. Now, when I looked at this target, I also had this confusion as to when FRBM Act is targeting the debt. I had a confusion whether it is referring to the total liabilities of the government or whether is it referring to only the public debt. I had a confusion here. To clear my confusion, I went to the FRBM Act 2003 in much greater detail, and I got to know that when we are referring to debt, it is not public debt, it is actually the total liabilities of the government. Please remember that. So when we are targeting to reduce the debt to 40% and 20% for the center and states respectively, it is not public debt, it is rather the total liabilities of the government. Are we clear on this? Okay. So if you look at the trends in the center's debt to GDP ratio, see, we adopted FRBM Act in the year 2003-04. Since the adoption of FRBM Act, can I say the overall debt of the center has got reduced in general. In the year 2003-04, we had debt of almost more than 60% of the GDP. By the 2018-19, our debt had got reduced to 45%. But we know that because of the COVID, government had to borrow more amount of money. So higher borrowings have led to a higher amount of debt. So right now, the center's debt is 59% totally. And if you're wondering as to how much is the debt of the states put together, you can see here. This is the debt of the states. And as you can see, the debt of the states has been increasing. And now it is increased to how much? 31%. So please have a look here. Center's debt is how much? 59%. All the states put together, its debt is almost like 31%. So we can say that general debt or the general combined debt of center and states, it is how much now? 90% of the GDP. So probably UPSC could play with certain words in the examination. So please remember this. When we say general government debt, remember this word. When we say general government debt means debt of the center as well as the states. So general government debt is how much now? 90% of GDP. But if you talk only about the central government debt, it is 59%. The state government debt, it is 31%. So this 59%, it has to be brought down to 40%. And this 31% has to be brought down to 20% by the end of March 31st, 2025. This is our target. Are we clear now, all of you? Yes. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, quickly, fast, one by one, answer to the question. Starting with practice question number 26. Which among the following are included in the public debt of the center? Which among the following are included in the public debt of the center? When you say public debt, what does it mean? I said clearly, when I say public debt, it includes only the internal debt and the external debt. So the right answer here should be 1 and 2 only. It does not include liabilities under the public account. Practice question number 27. Quickly. With reference to public debt of India, consider the following statements. The internal debt of the government is higher than the external debt. Yes. The internal debt is dominated by securities against NSSF. No. The internal debt is dominated by the dated securities. Practice question number 28. Practice question number 28. There has been increase in debt to GDP ratio of both center as well as states in the last 5 years. Yes. The FRBM Act seeks to reduce the combined debt, general government debt of center and states to below 60% of GDP by the end of 24-25. Yes. So right answer is both 1 and 2. Which among the following are included in the internal debt of the center? Please have a look at this question. Tricky. So I hope you must have heard of a concept known as off-budget financing. I hope you must have heard of that, right? So under off-budget financing, what happens is the government does not borrow the money directly. Rather, what the government does is the government will ask a PSU to borrow money and then undertake the expenditure. For such borrowed money, the government gives a guarantee on the repayment of loans. So such kind of indirect borrowings of the government, they get added up to the internal debt. So please remember that. So the off-budget financing, even though it's not part of the fiscal deficit, but it becomes part of the internal debt. So the right answer here should be 1, 2, and 3. Okay, coming to the concept of sustainability of debt. Just 5 minutes here with respect to sustainability of debt. Why I'm discussing this is because the debt of the center and states, it has increased to 90% of GDP. So you may expect a question related to sustainability of debt, which I had discussed in the previous year's economic survey. So quickly we'll revise this particular concept of sustainability of debt. Let's understand that. So if you look at conventional economics believes that we should not borrow more amount of money, which means that the debt, the borrowings of the center, the borrowings of the government, the liabilities of the government, it should not be more. Because if you have borrowed more, then it could lead to an adverse impact on the GDP growth rate. For example, if you borrow more amount of money, higher borrowings, what will happen is rate of inflation in the economy will increase because government will undertake spending. It will crowd out the private sector investment. It will increase the rate of interest on loans. So it is being said that we should not borrow more amount of money, because if you borrow more amount of money, it will lead to decrease in the GDP growth rate. So that is what was believed initially. But now, last year's economic survey has highlighted that how much money you borrow, that is not the question here. You can borrow as much money as you want to, but you should have a capacity to repay the loans. So it doesn't really matter whether you borrow 100 rupees, 1000 rupees, or even 1 lakh crore rupees, as long as you have a capacity to repay the loans. How does it come into picture? Let me give an example. Now let's say I have borrowed 100 rupees from you, for example, for a period of say 10 years, and I have required to pay you back 8% rate of interest. I borrowed 100 rupees at a rate of interest of 8% for a period of 10 years, which means after 10 years, how much money should I pay you back? Rupees 108, right? My interest rate is how much here? My interest rate is 8%. Now, let's say this 100 rupees which I have borrowed, I make investment in creation of roads, railways, ports, airports, and so on. And let's say after 10 years, I am getting a returns of say 12%, which means my GDP growth rate here, my GDP growth rate after say combined GDP growth rate after 10 years, it's say almost like 12%. So here I borrowed 100 rupees from you and I'm required to pay you back 108 rupees. But after 10 years, I'm getting back how much? 112 rupees. Are you getting this point? I'm getting 112 rupees. So what I will do, out of this 112 rupees, 108 rupees, I will pay you back. I will pay you back. Remaining 4 rupees, I will further make investment in construction of roads, railways, and so on. So look at this thing. Should I worry as to whether I'm borrowing 100 rupees, 1000 rupees, 1 lakh crores in this case? I don't have to worry. Why? Because my GDP growth rate here, the returns which I'm able to generate, this is much higher than the rate of interest which I'm required to pay you back. So I have a much higher capacity to repay the loans. Why do I have a higher capacity? Because my returns are higher than the rate of interest at which I'm required to pay you back. Now this reverses scenario. Let's say after 10 years, I'm required to pay you back 108 rupees. But my returns in this particular case on my investment is just 5, which means now after 10 years, I will have only 105 rupees with me, but I'm required to pay you back how much? 108. So don't you think I will fall into a kind of debt trap? Are you getting this point? Will I not fall into debt trap? Why? Because my returns is much lower than the interest which I'm required to pay you back. So this concept was highlighted in last year's economic survey, and we call it as sustainability of debt. To highlight the same thing here, you can see your borrowed money worth 1000 rupees, interest rate is 8%, maturity is 10 years. So you are getting an additional returns of 4, and then this keeps on happening. So that is why it says, don't worry about the quantity, worry about your capacity to repay the loans. Are you getting this point? And how do you enhance your capacity to repay the loans? By ensuring that the rate of interest at which you are borrowing loans is lower and the rate of GDP growth is higher. Are we clear now? So please have a look at this. So we have this concept of interest rate growth differential to understand the sustainability of debt in a particular country. This interest rate growth differential, how is it calculated? It is calculated as rate of interest at which you are borrowing loans minus the GDP growth rate. For example, if my GDP growth rate is 12% and the interest rate is 8%, so 8 minus 12, this will be equal to minus 4. So can I say if the value of IRGD is negative, my repaying capacity is higher? Yes, my repaying capacity is higher. On the other hand, let's say this is 8% and this is 5%. 8 minus 5, this will be equal to 3. So value is positive, which means my repaying capacity is lower. So more negative the value of IRGD, higher is my repaying capacity. Are you getting this point? Please attempt the question now. Practice question number 30. So if you read here, a particular country has a very high value of negative interest rate growth differential, IRGD. What does it denote? It denotes higher capacity to repay loans, higher debt sustainability, and enhanced capacity to provide stimulus. So answer would be 1 and 3 only. Are we clear? Yes. Okay. Now coming to the important aspects of FRBM Act, Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act. So let's quickly go through those things which become important from the perspective of a prelims examination. I hope all of you know the targets under FRBM Act. Reduce fiscal deficit to 3% of GDP. Combined debt should be at below 60%. But what students don't know is FRBM Act also puts a limit on the off-budget financing of the government. Remember I told you about off-budget financing? To explain you further, now let's say the government wants to construct national highways. Now to construct national highways, if the government is borrowing money and constructing national highway, don't you think government's fiscal deficit will increase, right? So to keep the fiscal deficit under control, the government will ask National Highway Authority of India to borrow money from the market and use that borrowed money for creation of national highways. And the government will give guarantee. Government will give guarantee on the repayment of such loans. This we call it as off-budget financing. Please have a look at this thing. Very important. This is from the FRBM Act. Can you see this here? The target. Government should not give guarantees which is more than 1.5% of the GDP. So very important as far as your prelims examination is concerned. So fiscal deficit is there, combined debt of center and state is concerned, and then next is with respect to the consolidated fund. Apart from that, another thing which I would also want to tell you, most students have a confusion here. See, government, when it wants to borrow money from RBI, Reserve Bank of India. So here, government can borrow short-term loans and long-term loans. With respect to short-term loans, these loans are borrowed under Ways and Means Advances, WMAs. As far as long-term loans are concerned, the long-term loans are for deficit financing. That is, financing is fiscal deficit, FD. The question is, does FRBM Act allow this deficit financing in India? Is it allowed? Most of the sources, it has been said that is not allowed. But once again, I'm repeating it once again, that FRBM Act allows deficit financing to take place. Our FRBM Act allows the government to borrow from the RBI under certain exceptional circumstances. What can be these external circumstances? These external circumstances could be national security, war, collapse of agriculture, structural reforms, decline in the GDP growth rate. The same escape clause which is provided for deviation of 0.5% of fiscal deficit. Remember this, okay? So that is thing here. So we have a escape clause. Please remember about this. So as we have known that right now the fiscal deficit of the government, it has increased to almost 6.8%. Last time also it had exceeded the limit of 3.5%. So it was expected that the government would amend the FRBM Act. But so far the government has not talked anything about amendment to the FRBM Act. So government has not made any statement with respect to amendments. So as of now, whatever the targets we have, only those things are important. And look at the statements. If you have seen one of the previous year prelims question, the question was the macroeconomic framework statement. It is presented along with the budget documents as part of, and the answer was FRBM Act. So whenever the finance minister presenting the budget, these first three statements are presented along with the budget documents. Please remember this. They are presented along with the budget documents. But the last statement, this one, medium-term expenditure framework statement, it is presented in the session after the budget session. So once the budget session ends, when the parliament convenes for the next session, in that session, this statement will be provided. Medium-term expenditure framework statement. Please remember this. Okay. So what is this one? So these two statements, they are combined and presented as single statement. So you can see here, medium-term fiscal policy statement and fiscal policy strategy statement. Under the first statement, that is medium-term fiscal policy statement, the finance minister provides a targets for various fiscal indicators. What are these indicators? Fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, primary deficit, tax revenue, non-tax revenue, and general government debt. Now, can I say the FRBM Act targets only the fiscal deficit to be reduced to 3% of GDP, only fiscal deficit. It is not targeting revenue deficit. It is not targeting effective revenue deficit, right? But when medium-term fiscal policy statement is to be presented, the finance minister is required to lay down targets for these 6 fiscal indicators. Please remember that. Okay. Not just laying down the targets, the finance minister is also required to highlight as to what strategies the government will adopt in order to meet these targets. For example, as far as fiscal deficit is concerned, right now it is 6.9, and the government says that it will bring it down to 6.4. So government will have to say as to how this will be brought down to 6.4 as part of fiscal policy strategy statement. Next, we have macroeconomic framework statement. As the name suggests, this gives us a detail of economic performance of different indicators. In particular, please have a look at this. GDP at current market prices, how much it is? 230 lakh crores. GDP at the real GDP, 147 lakh crores. So it gives us the details of these indicators. Okay, quickly, question number 31. What do you think is the answer? Let's see how many of you will get it right. The question is, read the question carefully, please. I can see some of you are giving me the answer as D. So please read the question carefully. Which among the following statements are presented along with the budget documents under the FRBM Act? This one is presented, this one, but this statement is presented in the session immediately after the budget session. Practice question number 32. What do you think is the answer? Quickly. Practice question number 32. What do you think is the answer? FRBM Act puts a limit on fiscal deficit. It keeps fiscal public debt under control. And at the same time, it has put restriction on the direct monetization. That direct monetization, under normal circumstances, it cannot be undertaken. But under exceptional circumstances, it can be undertaken. Practice question number 33. Which among the following indicators are considered under the medium-term fiscal policy statement presented under the FRBM Act? So the answer is all of the above, 1, 2, and 3. So as I said, there are 6 indicators, right? Okay. Now coming to the 15th Finance Commission recommendations. See, as far as 15th Finance Commission recommendations are concerned, I have already discussed the 15th Finance Commission recommendations in the last year's economic survey. So there is not much of a change because the recommendations are the same as well. So I would want you to revise the 15th Finance Commission recommendations from the last year's economic surveys discussion. Based upon that, you can attempt the questions. So in case you've already gone through the 15th Finance Commission recommendations, please do revise it because it becomes important for the perspective of your prelims examination. Okay. So in the last year's economic survey, I discussed all of these aspects. That is vertical distribution of taxes, horizontal distribution of taxes, Finance Commission grants to the states. Then we had discussed about the disaster management also. Like we had discussed about the new fund which has been come into picture. That is NDRMF, National Disaster Risk Management Fund. Then we had also discussed about the new fund which has been set up as part of Defense Modernization Program. So all of these things I've already discussed. So please revise these things from the last year's economic survey. Let's see how many of you know the answer. Practice question number 34. What do you think is the answer? With reference to 15 Finance Commission recommendations, consider following statements. The state share of taxes has remained unchanged at 42%. The income distance criteria has been given the highest weightage. Answer is B. The state's share of taxes has been dropped down to 41%, not 42%. Okay. Okay. Now coming to the disinvestment policy of the government. See, when we started discussion of our Barbell strategy, as I said, Barbell strategy has two legs. One is to provide safety nets to the people, and the second one is to provide for an agile approach to make the Indian economy to be more prepared to deal with the post-COVID world. So as part of that agile approach, the government has emphasized on undertaking disinvestment. So in this year's economic survey, there's a box. In this particular box, they have highlighted as to how the government's disinvestment policy has evolved over a period of time. So that could be asked in the UPSC Prelims examination in terms of the chronology of disinvestment, right? So let's understand the evolution of the disinvestment policy in India. So I hope all of you must have studied about Article 19 Clause 1G, right? So Article 19 Clause 1G gives each one of us the fundamental right to practice any profession, trade, business, or occupation. Article 19 Clause 1G, it's a fundamental right. So after the India adopted the Indian Constitution, we came up with the first Constitutional Amendment Act. This Constitutional Amendment Act imposed certain reasonable restrictions on Article 19(1) Clause G. What was the reasonable restriction? The reasonable restriction was that the government can curtail the freedom of a person to carry out any trade, profession, business in the matters of public welfare, public interest. What does this mean? This means that the government can take over an existing business. The government can prevent a person from carrying out a particular trade, a particular business. So this amendment, first Constitutional Amendment Act, which laid down reasonable restrictions on Article 19(1) Clause G, in turn paved way for the nationalization. And what the nationalization started with? It started with the nationalization of airlines in India. So in 1953, remember the year also? In 1953, that time we had almost 9 airlines. Some of these airlines include Air India, Bharat Airways, Deccan Airways, and so on. So all of these airlines got nationalized in the year 1953. So government took over the control and ownership of airlines in India. This was followed with nationalization of life insurance corporations. So we used to have large number of insurance companies in India. In the year 1956, all of these insurance companies were nationalized, and this in turn led to the formation of LIC, Life Insurance Corporation, LIC. Then later, we started undertaking nationalization of banks. First wave of nationalization was in the year 1969, and second one was in the year 1980. In 1969, 14 banks got nationalized, and in 1980, 6 banks got nationalized. So please remember this chronology, that first it was nationalization of airlines, then nationalization of life insurance companies, and then the nationalization of banks. Okay. So ultimately, before the year 1991 reforms, our main focus was on nationalization. But after 1991 reforms, now we are giving more amount of push towards the disinvestment. So you can see here, this is how the disinvestment policy has evolved in India. Started with the first Constitutional Amendment Act, Air Corporation Act, Life Insurance Corporation Act, banking companies, and then post 1991, there's a disinvestment. And I hope you already know that the government has come up with the new strategic public sector enterprise policy. In the strategic public sector enterprise policy, the government has declared some sectors to be strategic. And in these strategic sectors, the government would have minimal presence. Will have only 3 to 4 PSUs. All other PSUs would be merged into the larger PSUs, or they would be privatized. So as far as your prelims examination is concerned, please remember the list of sectors which have been categorized as strategic sectors in the strategic publicity enterprise policy. So in these sectors, we'll have only 3 to 4 PSUs. For example, in banking, we will have only around 3 to 4 public sector banks. The remaining public sector banks would either be privatized or merged into the larger public sector banks. In the non-strategic sectors, we will not have any PSU. All the PSUs would be privatized. And as far as prelims examination is concerned, these parts are very important. Please focus on this. First and foremost, the nodal agency for disinvestment in India is the Department for Investment and Public Asset Management, DPAM. It's a nodal agency. In principle approval of disinvestment of PSUs, it is given by Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs. So it is Cabinet Committee on Economic Affairs which will decide as to which PSUs should be disinvested. But once a decision is made, various modalities such as what percentage of government's ownership in a PSU should be sold, at what price the shares should be sold, all of these modalities, the minute decisions, they are taken by the alternative mechanism. And please remember, this alternative mechanism is headed by whom? By the finance minister. Clear? So these are some important aspects. Next, we are left with the last two topics. We'll quickly wind up the last two topics. Now coming to monetization of assets. And this is very important once again, because in the box provided in the economic survey, they have discussed about this. See, the assets of the government or the government agencies, they can be broadly categorized into two types. That is core assets and the non-core assets. When you say something as core assets, it basically means that these assets are integral to the functioning of a particular government agency. When you say something as non-core assets, it means that they are non-integral to the functioning of a government agency. Now, for example, for Department of Railways, what would be its core assets? Its core assets would be railway stations. Its core assets will be railway tracks, locomotives, passenger trains. So they are integral to the functioning of the Ministry of Railways itself. Are you getting this point? But let's say Department of Railways has a very high profile building in a very high profile area in Mumbai. Building. Is it integral to its functioning? It is a non-core asset. Similarly, along the railway tracks, a railway has surplus land. Is it integral to its functioning? No, non-core asset. I hope you're getting this point. So the assets can be categorized as core assets and the non-core assets. And please focus here. What we are going to do as far as the core assets is concerned, all of these core assets, we are going to lease it out to the private sector under the national monetization pipeline, about which I have already discussed. So this national monetization pipeline is prepared by Okay, this national monetization pipeline, it is prepared by the Niti Aayog. Remember this. When it comes to non-core assets such as land and buildings, what we are going to do is either we'll lease them out, or we'll sell them to the private entities. And for leasing and selling these non-core assets, the economic survey has highlighted that the government is going to set up the National Land Monetization Corporation, which will be 100% owned by the government. So this corporation as such will undertake the monetization of the non-core assets such as land, buildings, etc. And once again, look at this. Monetization of core assets comes under Niti Aayog. Monetization of non-core assets comes under what? DPAM, Department of Investment and Public Asset Management. So let's quickly have a look at the question. Look at practice question number 39. So as I said, National Land Monetization Corporation is being incorporated as a 100% government-owned entity? Yes. The Niti Aayog is a nodal agency for the monetization of non-core assets. No, it is DPAM. So this is how you could get a question. Clear? And if you see this one, National Monetization Pipeline. Remember in the budget class also I told you, National Monetization Pipeline covers the monetization of only the core assets. It does not cover the non-core assets. And among the different sector, the road sector accounts for the highest share of the National Monetization Pipeline. Okay, coming to last announcement, not very big, just a small announcement here. That is with respect to policy measures to enhance the efficiency of the expenditure. See, the economic survey has highlighted that government is undoubtedly spending more amount of money in order to provide fiscal stimulus. And accordingly, it has to ensure that the efficiency with which the government is spending money, it has to be quite higher. So government efficiency in its expenditure should be higher. Now, for example, when the government is spending money, it should ensure that it is creating a maximum impact. Similarly, the government should ensure that when it is spending money, it has to rationalize its expenditure, cut down on its unnecessary expenditure. That is what we call it as efficiency. So the economic survey has highlighted that as far as efficiency is concerned, the government has given a new fillip to the GEM portal, Government E-Marketplace portal. Now, what is this portal? Government E-Marketplace portal. Now, different government ministries, departments, agencies, they need to procure different goods and services, which can include computers, laptops, tables, chairs, printers, and so on. So whenever they need any kind of goods and services, these goods and services would have to be procured from the GEM portal, Government E-Marketplace portal. So it's something like Amazon or Flipkart for the government. I hope you're getting this. So when you want to buy something, you go on Amazon and Flipkart. So for the government, it is the Government E-Marketplace portal. And please remember, from the perspective of the prelims examination, two things. One is the General Financial Rules 2017, which basically lays down as to how the government should conduct its financial transactions. It mandates that whatever goods are available on the GEM portal, they would have to be compulsorily procured by the government ministries and departments. So let's say there are 10 goods which are listed on the GEM portal. For procurement of those 10 goods, the government ministries and departments cannot procure from outside the GEM portal. If something is listed on the GEM portal, compulsory those goods have to be procured from the GEM portal only. Now, for example, let's say the government has to 10 minutes. Now, let's say the government wants to procure this particular marker, and let's say this marker is listed on the GEM portal. Then the government has to procure this marker only from the GEM portal, not from outside the GEM portal. And let's say the marker is not listed in the GEM portal, only then it can procure from outside the GEM portal. I hope you are getting this point, right? So this has been stipulated under the General Financial Rules. And this GEM portal, it is hosted by the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. It is not hosted by the Ministry of Finance. It is under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. So that is one thing which you should understand from the perspective of prelims. Other things are not really important because, in the economic survey, it has highlighted that whatever goods and services which the government is procuring from the GEM portal, if you compare those prices in the GEM portal with Amazon or Flipkart, the prices are much lower. So government is able to procure different goods and services from the GEM portal at a price which is much lower than what we find on the Amazon or Flipkart, and that is why the government's efficiency in the expenditure is higher. That is what it says. Not really important, but what is important is these 2 points. Apart from that, the discussion will be incomplete if I don't discuss about this Public Procurement Policy of MSMEs 2018. So under the Public Procurement Policy of 2018, whenever any government agency, ministry or department wants to procure goods and services, at least 25% of the goods and services would have to be procured from MSMEs. Please remember the target. 25%. Earlier it used to be 20%, but later it has got changed to 25%. So at least 25% of the goods and services would have to be procured from MSMEs. Within MSMEs also, you have certain MSMEs which are owned by poor and vulnerable sections, which include, say, SC/ST entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, and so on. So out of this 25%, a certain target has been set for procurement of goods and services from the MSMEs owned by SC/ST and women entrepreneurs. No need to remember as to how much is to be procured, but just remember that there is a separate target as far as procurement of goods and services from the MSMEs owned by SC/ST and women entrepreneurs. So right answer is both 1 and 2. Okay, so this is it as far as the second chapter is concerned. So the next chapter is with respect to balance of payment, BOP. So which I will start discussing in the next week. So these things I'll start discussing next week. So as I said, you have almost like 11 chapters from the economic survey. 2 chapters we are completed. The remaining chapters I will complete in the next session. And as far as the approach is concerned, as I've already told you, economic survey is very bulky. It is very voluminous. A lot of things which are not relevant from the perspective of the UPSC examination. Cost benefit ratio is very poor. So what we will do is, whatever those things are important from the perspective of prelims, those things will convert into prelims based MCQs and we'll be discussing that. Clear? Fine then. So in case if you have any doubts, you can start asking your doubts.